lots of faces here, some very familiar, some I haven't seen for a while, some people I haven't met yet. So really welcome to this class, or this talk really about ego state therapies. We're just going to wait a short while because I know we've got a few more people. Won't keep you waiting long. If people taking a while to come in, then I'll make a start. I'll just wait for a few more minutes. So just to first and foremost, I will start by introducing me, because it gives you an idea as to who I am. Some of you, as I say, know very well who I am. I haven't seen you for a long time. Some of you know and have seen me recently. And some people here I don't think I've met before. So my name is Peter Mabbutt. I am the academic head for LSCCH Asia and LSCCH, or London School of Clinical Communication and Hypnosis. We're basically the same organisation, but as the name Asia suggests, we have part of our operation running within Asia itself, in Malaysia, Singapore. Pre-lockdown, I was very fortunate to go and visit there quite frequently. Unfortunately, during lockdown, my visits are via Zoom and Microsoft Teams. But we're also very active now within the UK and within Europe. And we tend to, we've also started to be talking to quite a few people from Australia. And as you'll see in a moment, some of our accreditations, we are accredited in Australia as well. So, as I say, my name's Peter Mabbutt. My background is that I am a hypnotherapist, obviously, but prior to that, I was a psychopharmacologist. My initial foray into work many years ago was working with drugs in the brain. So I was looking at emotions, I was looking at mood disorders and so on, but originally I was researching the way in which drugs affected the brain, and drugs helped to treat these particular disorders. Love my job, but got more and more interested in the underlying causes of these disorders, recognizing too that when we give a drug, don't get me wrong, I'm pro-drugs. I'm not one of these people who says don't take drugs. My belief is they need to be given appropriately and not just handed out like sweets, because they cause more problems, as you will we'll talk shortly about with the ego states. They cause more problems if they are just handed out, with the addiction issues that are out there. But I also came to an understanding that certainly for mood disorders, psychological issues, they often provided a sticking plaster, which was great, helped you function, helped you move. Take away the sticking plaster, problem still there. That's when I started to get interested. And cut a very long story short, I was good at what I did, promoted, which was nice. And as any of you know, when you get promoted, you're often promoted further and further and further away from the things you really like doing. And so I ended up doing stuff I really didn't like doing. And then with the merger of Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital with King's, my post was essentially cut. I was offered another post, decided this was the point at which I wanted to make a change. So in the mid-90s, that's when I then made the decision, right, I'm going to train as a counsellor. Started looking to train as a counsellor, discovered hypnotherapy, and to be quite honest, haven't looked back since. It's been my life and my passion for more years than I care to remember. I was only talking the other day about how long I've been doing this. So my career has been, I do a lot of work Initially, I was doing a lot of work with depression and anxiety. Then I started moving into doing work within the mind-body connection, working with hospitals, doctors, pain management. I was integral in setting up the hypnotherapy unit within the University of Malaya Hospital, the pain management unit that we've had running there, where we were using hypnotherapy as the main way of treating brachial plexus neuralgia and various other intractable pain conditions that weren't responding well to any other form of treatment. I've also really, one of my big areas of working is I work with trauma, hence my interests of learning EMDR, eye movement desensitization, reprocessing, and also ego state therapy, which is what we're going to be talking about today. The joy for me was then discovering that one of my therapies I really enjoy, EMDR, actually does integrate with ego state therapy, and I'll talk about that later on. They operate independently of each other, but ego state therapy is a wonderful way of integrating with other therapies that are out there, and that is where we will be starting to talk about when we get towards the end of our session today. So what I'll be doing is I'll be giving you an overview. I'll give you an understanding of what ego states are, what they're not. I'll give you an understanding of ego state therapy, how it is process, how you go through doing these things, what it means to be using ego states, where it can be used, where it most effectively used, and also where it integrates with other therapies and how it integrates. I'll also be putting it very much into a perspective of where this fits within the process of therapy. EST, as we sometimes call it, is a therapy in its own right. However, it is a therapeutic tool that really should be placed within a proper context. So, so from that perspective, let me sort of make a start. Those of you who know me know I do like questions. I'm not one of these people that doesn't want to be questioned. So absolutely, you can ask. When I'm in my presentation, I won't necessarily see if a hand goes up because I have my presenting screen in front of me, but do say something. I will see if you send a message in chat, so I'll get around to those. And obviously at the end we've got plenty of time to ask questions and to talk about this. So without further ado, let me just go in and share my screen. Okay. Right. Well, this is we're introducing ego state therapy, and what ego state therapy is, and perhaps you'll be able to think, right, how can I apply this within my own particular practice? Or you might even think, I'm recognizing these ego states working within me. So the first thing we want to do is to kind of put this into a perspective, a historical perspective. And really it goes back to the dawn of the advent of psychotherapy itself. It's a psychodynamic approach within psychotherapy, which means it has the analytical concepts within it. It is uncovering, it is about insight gaining, cathartic release where appropriate, etc., etc., etc. And it comes from the time of Freud. Paul Federn, who was a contemporary of Freud, he's the person that's generally credited as conceptualizing this concept of ego states. He was the first person that really started to think about these coming from Freud's ideas with the id, ego, superego, and so on. And at that time, these ego states were coming into an understanding of what they were. And it was Edward Weiss who looked at what Paul Federn was doing, and he extended the theories into a concept that really became the very early seeds of what ego state therapy is today. And it was kind of bubbling away in the background until two people, John and Helen Watkins, started to explore this idea of the ego states and then take them into a very different direction with their conceptualization. There were ideas that were coming in and being shared between other therapies itself, but this idea of ego states was finally published in the early 70s by John and Helen Watkins, and has since then become a very dynamic therapy, a very effective therapy itself as well. Now, it does have links with transactional analysis, the parent, adult, child ego states that come within that. It also has links within the concepts that you would see in psychosynthesis and also within Gestalt therapy as too. So there are links that go out. They've been sharing from each other, but you'll also find that ego states has generated other therapies. For example, the internal family systems therapy. It's borrowed an awful lot from ego state therapy, very closely associated to ego state therapy. But ego states is the original therapy upon which this was all based. Now, we know, that we've got this concept of the brain being compartmentalized, the mind rather being compartmentalized, and ego state therapy really does bring this conceptualization to the fore. It looks on the mind as a constellation of sub-personalities, and they talk and refer to this idea of a family of selves. There are these sub-personalities within the overarching personality that are working together, that are creating the way in which we interact, we behave, our beliefs, and so on, and many other elements that will be there. And each of these sub-personalities is what we consider an ego state. And an ego state also has its these ego states have various different breakdowns in their classification that we'll be kind of looking at very, very shortly. The other thing, before anybody asks, yes, it is similar to parts therapy, but it is distinct from parts therapy. Parts therapy, is, I would say, a very, very watered down concept that was taken from ego states, was taken from, I can never say it, transactional analysis, TA, that's easy. So they are similar, but there are very different distinctions in the way we work with ego states. And the concept of the ego state is more complex than the concept of a part. So an ego state, what actually is it? Well, it is a natural part of our psyche. It's a very natural part of our mind. We all have them, or ego state therapy, ego state theorists state we all have them. And I'm very much in agreement with that. So they are a natural part of who we are. They develop in order to help us cope within the world, to function appropriately within the world, and so on. Each ego state itself is and this is where the complexity starts to come in, is a very much an integrated pathway of both mood and thought. Ego states have their own set of moods, each individual ego state has its own belief structures and so on, as I'll highlight a little later. So it is very much, when we talk about the word or the term sub-personalities, they are sub-personalities. They are, you will see, and if you work with them, you will find they have their own individual personalities. And they develop, essentially, as probably everyone here knows and understands with parts therapy, but they develop when we encounter situations that we need to respond to. They're part of our way of learning to cope. They're part of our way of protecting ourselves, part of our survival instinct, part of our development as human beings. And they tend to develop, develop in quite an effective way. And the idea is that they grow, they evolve, they might want to take a step away from being part of the whole personality, but they are still part of that if they realize that, you know, they're tired, or they feel that their function is no longer necessary and they don't want to change their function, all in a very functional way within the mind. We also think that most of them, not all of them, most of these things are created during childhood. So as we develop as a child, we're looking at the world around us, we're understanding how to interact. Ego states are formed that determine our thoughts, our beliefs, our feelings, our behaviors at that moment. And they learn, it's a functional thing. They observe, and as we grow through life, so we're finding that we, with these ego states, adapt, grow, and evolve with us. However, not all will develop in childhood. Of course, you know, we always have the opportunity to develop ego states at any point in our lives. We enter into a situation we've never met before. Well, the constellation of ego states we already have will try and help us adapt to that and to manage that. And you might find another ego state is formed and developed if we really aren't finding the way in which we can adapt to that new novel situation. So something new is formed, and then that becomes part of the whole. And this concept of a subpersonality, they really are mini personalities. Each ego state has its own particular role, it has its own particular function. So it might be a courageous ego state, it might be the chatty ego state, it might be a teaching ego state, it might be a shy ego state, and so on. So it has its own role within the mind, but also within that, it has its own personality. It's, you know, it will be a part of the whole personality, but within its role, it will have its own personality. So, for example, my teaching ego state is very much at the forefront at the moment, and it's got its own personality. I know what I want to say, I know how I want to come across when I'm teaching. I have that confidence that I like to think I have, and all of that. Then I might go into another situation where I might not be so confident because it's something I've not done before, or it might be a situation where I have lacked confidence in the past and my ego state is there in the driving seat, and it is allowing me to lack that confidence. So a different part of my mind starts to fit in at that point. And it's the ego state with the role and the personality that drives it. But also within that, it has its own mood. There are different moods that it might have. It might, there might be a happy ego state. I might have a stressed ego state. You've all had those experiences, perhaps, where you've been somewhere and, step away from the concept of conditioned responding. I mean, they are great concepts, but for ego state theory, you go into a situation, you're happy, there's a happy ego state running around in there doing its thing for you, and you see something or you encounter someone and suddenly your mood just changes. So what we would be saying there is a different ego state has taken over, and it's brought in its anger, it's brought in its depression, it's brought in its stress, it's brought in its hilarity, or whatever it might be. So it has its own particular role. And within the role, the function it has, it might be part of a few constellations of other ego states. So it has the role as being part of my teaching ego state, but I'll have an ego state with the function that teaches. There'll be an ego state that has the role of teaching, but it also might be bringing back in information from my past clients so that I can reconnect with giving examples of how I've been working with people. Then there will be, when I do a demonstration, for example, I'll have the therapist ego state jumping in, and so on. They all have that role, individual roles, but they also have functions within the whole. And one that people sometimes when we work with clients can be quite challenging for some. They do also have a gender identity. In general, the identity of the gender, the gender identity of the person, it tends to be kept within the majority of the ego states. However, you can find that there are ego states, totally functional ego states, that have a different gender identity. So, we could say people who are more in touch with, and I hate the sexist nature of these terminologies, the sort of gentle feminine side of things, or the ego state that has that particular role and function might gender identify as female. So you might find you're working with somebody who gender identifies as a man, and they have a female ego state within the constellation of ego states. But again, we've got to bear in mind, in general, we'll talk about dysfunction later on. These are all functional aspects within that. And we need to bear in mind certain elements about ego states. The one thing that is important, and you'll hear me go on about, is it does identify as part of the whole person. This is important for me preempting a question that I know always comes up in a moment. So it identifies as a whole part of the whole person. It knows that it is a part of a constellation, of a family of states. However, it also has its own identity, and it speaks in the first person, it speaks in the I. It refers to other ego states as other, it refers to them in the third person, they, and so on. We also know that an ego state cannot be eliminated. In the early days of ego state therapy, when the Watkins were starting to do therapy using it, they used to banish ego states, tell them to go away. Bear in mind, this is 1970s, so thought has moved on an awful lot since then, partly because of ego state therapy. Used to tell them to go away, so the ego states would go away, be banished. And a couple of their clients were perfectly okay for, I think one of them was up to 10 years, and 10 years later they came back with a particular issue similar to the one that they had presented with in the first place. And doing the ego state work, they uncovered the banished ego state, told it to go away, to just fade. That was still there. All it had done was gone off and hidden and festered in the background of the mind, so to speak. And its resentment was producing the presenting issue that the client was bringing to them 10 years after originally seeing them. However, even though it cannot be eliminated, the point of ego state therapy is that the ego states can change. The ego states adapt and survive, but even when they're doing something dysfunctional through the therapeutic process, the ego state can change itself. And also, it can choose to be hidden or inactive. So what this basically means is that it might decide in a functional way that it's tired. And so the ego state disappears away from the main part of the mind and goes to rest somewhere. It might choose that, it might recognize in a functional way that its role is no longer necessary. So it becomes inactive. But bearing that in mind, we also know that they have feelings. And so a hidden or inactive ego state might be an ego state that feels that someone had been rude or aggressive to it. So it might then refuse to cooperate with the therapeutic process, cooperate with other ego states that are then triggering this issue that they're presenting with. And it can certainly refuse to talk. And there are ways within ego states therapy to connect with these particular states. And before anyone asks, no, ego state therapy will not cause dissociative identity disorder. People often ask me that because they, when they fully understand, we even get the ego states to name themselves. So they come out, it could be Fred or Sylvia or Barry or whatever, but they can also be strength, they could be scared, they could be flower. So they have identity and they name themselves, but within that, as I keep saying, they are aware that they are part of the whole. With dissociative identity disorder, it's the result of a severe trauma, usually, very severe trauma, in which the ego family fractures. Each state develops in its own way and without the concept that it is part of the whole. It defines itself as a personality in its own right, not a sub-personality. It is often aware of other states within the DID issue that the client's presenting with. However, it doesn't see them as part of the whole. It is the only one. So it is a severe fracturing of the mind. Ironically, well, not ironically, but very nicely, ego state therapy is one of the therapies that is effective in helping to treat DID. So it is powerful in that respect. So I've talked about, and I'll be more tell you more about introject surface states and underlying states and executive in a moment, because as I say, it's more than just a part. There are different types, if you want to call them that, of ego state. And so what are these types? What are the main types? There are many different ones out there, and we do work with them in particularly different ways. So the first one that I've already kind of talked about, which is the executive or the driving seat. I'm happy to take questions as we go through, as long as it doesn't detract from what I'm actually saying. So someone there saying, yes, if you do want to ask me a question, I'm happy to take them. If it's something that's a bit more abstract, then keep it to the very end, if that's okay. So I do like questions. So as I was saying, the executive, I've alluded to it. But it is the driving seat in, and that's why I put the graphic in there. Basically, it's the ego state that's dominant at any particular time. And in so doing, what it does is it determines a person's personality at any one time. The executive state, or the executive state is the ego state that is sitting in the executive, in the driving seat. So I've got a few ego states popping around in my head, we would say. So my teaching ego state is certainly there, forefront. It's the main one in my executive, but it might be switching between other ego states, as we talk about clients I've had, as I mentioned earlier, another ego state that's part of the teaching states, but has a different set of emotions and different way of thinking might come in at that time, which kind of helps me go through that. So the ego states come and go from the executive. They drive our function. The ego state that is enjoying watching the programs I watch at the moment on Netflix, that ego state is nicely resting at the moment. It's not coming in at all. The moment I finish my day today, there is a particular series I'm watching and I can't wait to see the next episode, the Netflix ego state will come in and my teaching state will go to one, push way into the background until it needs to teach first thing tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock in the morning. And that's the joy of teaching from the UK and in Asia. But what I'm saying here is the dominant state at any one time. That's what we call the executive, drives a person's personality. And as I said, it changes according to the various situations that we might be going into. After I've eaten here, after I've spoken to you, I've got half an hour in which I can then go nip downstairs, grab myself something to eat. So a hunger ego state will come in. Then I'm doing a clinical supervision. So my clinical supervisor ego state comes in. Then I'll need to walk my dog. So I've got the, I love dogs, I love animals ego states coming in. So it's always switching and changing. But they're the ones in the ego state, in the executive. And the non-executive ego states, these are, not surprisingly, the ego states that are not in the executive at any particular time. But the important thing is that many of these ego states are aware of what's happening. So they're used frequently, they're in contact with the other ego states and so on. Some of them may be very unconscious and very unaware. They know they're part of the whole, but they're choosing to hide somewhere deep down. They may also be locked away as part of a defense mechanism. For example, with something that's traumatic that's happened to them, there might be a place there, they're being hidden by other ego states. Something we'll talk about in a moment called protector states coming in. And Tom says, can more than one ego state manifest concurrently, or is it one at a time? Essentially, it's one at a time, but they will be, so you've got quite a few close to the executive, so they're jumping in and jumping out as they go, as we handle each individual situation. So they come and they go, they can change very, very rapidly. And we're not aware that we're not aware of what of them actually doing this probably. Types of ego states, slideshows interject, I'll talk about what that means, that's an important one. And also surface, I'll talk about surface and underlying as well very shortly. So, so you'll get to understand what all of that is about. So we come to surface. A surface state is very close to the executive. So these are the states that are used quite frequently. They are the states that often jump in and jump out of the driving seat, so to speak. They go in and out of the executive because they are the ones that we use an awful lot, as it says there. And they define our daily responses. They're the ones that take us through our day. They're kind of all milling around the executive in a metaphorically speaking. And so when you go and do one thing, one ego state jumps in, another one steps outside, and so it goes. They are also, hence the image here, they communicate very well with each other. They're very aware of what's going on. They're very aware of the plan for the day and how you're going to be doing things, and so on and so forth. I have a very wonderful ego state that lets me procrastinate quite often, and it's always waiting to jump in, waiting for one of my colleagues to call me up, and then I can go off and chat with being able to avoid work. But that is one of my ego states. I'm very aware of in my ego state. As for me, part of that procrastination ego state is also one that I do make quite good use of at times in a functional way. And they are also aware of what happens when other ego states are in the executive. So they are very aware that, you know, what's going on. Even my teaching, my Netflix ego state or my Doctor Who ego state, or whichever one it is, will be aware of my teaching ego state and what's happening, because, you know, my rest and relaxation ego states are ones that are quite frequently in the executive. I'd like a little bit more of them to be there, but hey, real world we live in. Underlying states, these are interesting because they vary in proximity to the executive. So in essence, they are those that are there and can come into the executive, but some are rarely in the executive itself. Sunita, I've got a lot to say about inner child in a minute. So quick answer, inner child could be considered an ego state, yes. But there is a whole therapy, as you know, built around inner child work. So you might find, as well, as I said before, some may be completely isolated. As a memory comes up, if you think about a memory that comes up that you haven't thought about in a long, long time, we would say within ego state theory that that is an ego state that has been quite deep within the underlying states. It's not been used very often. And connecting with it, suddenly it starts to come back into the executive once. When I was training in hypnotherapy many, many years ago, we doing something called the early learning set, those of you who know about the early learning set, and in that particular script there's a suggestion that you can go back in time to something that you haven't thought of in a very long while. And at that point I went back to a childhood memory, a lovely childhood memory that incorporated smell, my olfactory sense, color. I mean, it just had every single, I mean, it was wonderful. Now that, from ego state therapy concepts, is an ego state that was functionally quite happy sitting down in deep somewhere in the underlying states. It was kind of aware of everything, but it hadn't needed to be used. When we went back to that, bang, it got connected and it came forward with me. Sarah, I will answer that about the explanation very shortly when we talk about the theory. We'll talk about the actual therapy concept. So we also got to remember that some, because of a variety of different things, some may choose to be isolated, some may be isolated by these things called protector states, because they're traumatized and they're being kept safe. Some might be isolated because they're, you know, really scared. So, and they hidden away, which is why people can go for long, long periods of time after experiencing a trauma, seemingly okay, and then that one thing connects into that ego state and it jumps up fully in the executive, and bang, you then enter into full PTSD. Happily, most hold positive and pleasant memories, but it is the underlying states where the trauma and other deep-seated issues are certainly held in there. But we also have these things called inner strength states. They are thought to be ego states, but in something that's different to the development of ego states, they claim to have been born with the client. Mira, I'll answer your question about schizophrenia very shortly. So they claim to be born with the client. They are there. They are a constant. As you born, they come with you. That's, in the early work with the Watkins, where they were saying that basically when they questioned the inner strength states, they were identifying as having been born. The other states are aware that they developed in the needs for a particular situation. And they also claim to have knowledge of the client's purpose in life. So they're part of driving, one would say, some of our instincts, our early instincts, to go on going forward. The inner strengths states, these are interesting, again, slightly different from what we know about the main ego states, and they remain consistent in their role. The role doesn't change, the role won't change. However, as we know, as we experience working with ego states, they do dramatically change quite. You can go from a very malevolent state into something that is very productive and positive for people. And the point here is that they are, hence the name, in the strength states. They are caring, they're supportive, and they tend to be quite strong. However, they can lose energy. So a traumatized person, their inner strength state might become very lacking in energy, because it's been giving its energy to protecting that person with defense mechanisms and so on. However, the nice thing is that they can regain strength and they can gain their energy as therapy progresses throughout the process of however long it takes. And certainly they can be asked to come forward into the executive. So we can bring them into the executive, we can work with them there and connect them with other ego states, as we'll talk about in a moment. Now, introjects, these are very interesting elements. They are not ego states, but they're considered to be forms of defense mechanisms. And what an introject is, primarily they're representations, and it's important we remember that word representation, the representation as created by the client's mind of people alive or people who are dead. They can also be representations of things like a pet dog or a thunderstorm or a swimming pool, whatever it might be. The important thing is they represent a moment. They don't represent an entire concept of a person, or a situation. They represent a moment in time that's associated with that person. So it brings in associated beliefs, associated feelings, and so on. So, for example, you might have a very caring mother, but in therapy, she might have said something to you, or her father might have said something to you that was perhaps hurtful. There's no textbook on being a parent, and sometimes things are said that aren't meant to be said, but they're said. And so an introject might come in of the stern mother, which might disturb the client, because they're thinking, right, well, my mother was always very, very pleasant, etc. to me. So the introject is certainly something we will want to explore and work with. And introjects, not always associated with nasty stuff. They can be very kind, they can be very loving, they can be very caring, they can be supportive, they can be motivating, but they can also be very scary. They can be very aggressive, abusive, they can be sarcastic, they can be violent. So when I'm working with survivors of trauma, survivors of sexual abuse, or survivors of rape, or anything like that, the introject could be the rapist, could be the abuser, could be the parent that let them down because they perceived the parent knew what was going on. So that image could come up in therapy. Now, the interesting thing is they certainly are not seen as part of the whole, and they don't identify as part of the whole, but they can communicate with ego states. So they are still influencing. For example, I've been working with somebody recently. He was raped by a 14-year-old, 15-year-old person when he was 7, but a 15-year-old teenage boy when he was 7. And his introject was interacting with he's confident in his life, but elements come in where he will feel the confidence, and then the introject will be coming in. And we identified this introject and telling him things like, yes, but you're no good, you're dirty, you're nobody likes you, nobody would love you. I'm the only person who's doing anything for you. You need to be secretive, you can't tell anybody anything. And so his adult life was basically being influenced by this introject. The nice thing is, after working with him, he's managed to go from being somebody who wasn't saying anything, was really trying not to think about what happened to him, to actually now having reported it to the police. And the person involved is now in police custody, as they say. So Chokman says, these introjects represent something or someone. Do they live within an ego state? No, they live within the mind. They're in the mind. They're a representation in the mind, but they are separate to ego states. So you've got ego states which hold on to all sorts of things. These are metaphorical representations, if you want to call it that. They're metaphorical representations, but that have strong influence on the way in which they interact with ego states. Introjects can change. We can empower people over the introject. The introject itself can change and can come into the executive. So if you think about Gestalt 2-chair work or hypnodrama, that sort of approach, where you're stepping into the mindset of another person metaphorically, in that respect, one could argue, well, that is actually bringing the introject, the other person, into the executive to gain some form of understanding from the perceived perspective of the other. Remember, it's always perceived. We're not literally stepping into somebody else's mind. And very much your client can be empowered over an aggressor interject. What I like to do with aggressor interjects, so they're the nasty ones, is I give them strength to be able, I guide them towards strength to be able to speak to the interject, be able to say what they need to say to the interject, to be able to say, for example, with a loving parent who was critical at one point, the critical interject, the client can talk to that interject to find out why it said what it said at that particular time, and so on. So it's just really getting a communication channel running. So the actual therapy approach itself. So what do we do within therapy? Well, first and foremost, where do ego states or the ego state therapy fit into the therapeutic process? Very much, we need to remember it's psychodynamic, therefore it's potential emotions, insights, and insights can be quite dramatic sometimes, and so on. So it is not the first thing you do in a therapy session by any means. Ideally, whatever therapeutic background you have, you do the stabilization work outside of ego state therapy. So you spend time working with the client in the here and now, building up their sense of psychological strength, making small changes to their way in which they're interacting with the present. Once you're sure they're able to deal with the analytical nature of ego states, then you bring that in. And that can be carried out over one session, or it can be carried out over many, many sessions, depending on how fractured the mind is and how traumatized the person is. And then after ego state therapy is complete, it is important to, whichever therapeutic background you have, do the maintenance of change. You know, you're ensuring that change is maintained, you're looking towards integrating change in the future, and also you're giving time, certainly with trauma, for the client to get comfortable with their new ego states and the ego states, the new way in which their ego states are communicating, but for other ego states that might have been hidden to come bubbling up. I'm very used to the fact of working with a client and they're saying, oh, this is brilliant, I don't think I need to come and see you very much and very many more times. You know, let's do a few more sessions and then I'll be out of your hair, so to speak. And then 3 sessions later, something has bubbled up because it's had either the courage to bubble up or the defense mechanisms have stepped away and it's suddenly appeared. And then we're going back into a little bit of stabilization and then into ego state therapy. So the other question is, do we do hypnosis or do we not do hypnosis with this? Well, the answer to both is yes. Basically, it was originally developed using hypnosis. The hypnotic state was used in order to facilitate access to the ego states. However, it also can be used using just basic relaxation approaches as the therapy has progressed. Yes, you know, I'm a hypnotherapist by trade, so I use hypnosis, but I also, if somebody is a little bit nervous of hypnosis, I use relaxation. If they're nervous of hypnosis and relaxation, and, you know, for therapists who are not hypnotherapists, relaxation and also conversational approaches can be used. There are ways in which we can talk to the client, we learn to observe the client, and that's the point in which you see then the ego state has come into an executive, or you can guide a person through the questions we ask and what we ask somebody to think about that brings an ego state into the executive, and then you start talking about it. To answer Sarah's question about do we explain, yes, informed consent. The client needs to understand the process. The client needs to understand the concepts that we're applying. And I would say good 95% of the people I work with wanting to use ego states buy into the concept and really enjoy the approach. A lot of it sounds barking mad. A lot of therapy techniques sound barking mad until you actually take or use them. And the next thing you know is, hey, blimey, this is really powerful and really empowering. So yes, informed consent, an idea of what it is without going to psychobabble on them, and then moving forward into using it. So the goals that we have within ego state therapy is basically to locate and treat dysfunctional ego states, which are known as vaded ego states or vaded states. And then within that location, we then encourage a greater communication between the ego states. So we're looking at what the vaded state needs, how the vaded state needs to express itself, what it might need within communicating with others. Perhaps there need to be some form of dialogue and negotiations between what are known as protector states. These are caring states that protect damaged states. So a state that has been fearful and has been hidden for a long time because protector states are keeping it back, or our sexual state, our sexuality state, because of a bad sexual experience has been hidden and protected by protector states. There might need to be a period of negotiation with the protector states in order to have the courage for the sexual ego state to come forward and to once again connect with its ability to work with the body in creating sexual enjoyment. So there is communication that goes on, but also what is also very useful is it's letting our clients know how they can use ego states for their own benefit. So, you know, we teach self-hypnosis. Within ego states therapy, we teach the use of the ego states. Now, obviously, we're not teaching the client to go in and do deep traumatic work, but we're teaching them how to use those ego states as they go through their life. And I've got clients who, when they recognize they're entering a situation that they're feeling nervous about, they have conversations with their ego states and come to a resolution and a functional adaptation to situations. So ego state therapy really does use family therapy approaches. Remember, we get ego states to name themselves. They have their own functions. What we do is we're very respectful to ego states. We ask one state if it's okay for another state to come forward and communicate. We then have that communication going on. We might act as facilitators for two ego states, two or more ego states, to have dialogue with each other as they're trying to come to a functional agreement and arrangement. Ego states might have things to say to other ego states. It's fascinating. And our role as therapists is to facilitate this communication and to support the ego states in supporting each other. Also, this thing called conflicted ego states, so resolving conflicts between these states. So one state might have a strong belief that I'm a dirty person, and the other state might have a belief that I'm actually a very valid human being. And this one is so disconnected from its communication with other states. It's just taking on board what the introject has been saying. And so we might need to have that conflict resolved. It also allows us to access hidden states, states that are choosing to hide, and helping them to have a voice. So, for example, it might be we try and encourage them to come forward, or we encourage other ego states to come in and either speak on their behalf or be with them as they're speaking, so to speak. We also help resolve dysfunctional protector state behaviors. Like I said before, you might have a protector state, which is a state that really wants to do what it's doing, protecting. Its role is to protect. But with protector states, they can overly protect. And they can push somebody, won't let another ego state come forward that's really wanting to be heard and wanting to be evolved. Andrea, how is ego states different from parts therapy? What I said earlier is that parts therapy is a very, very watered down version of ego states. Within parts therapy, there isn't the complexity that we ascribe to an ego state within it. So it's a much more complex approach within it. And Sarah asks, can we do ego state therapy online? My entire practice is online, and I do an awful lot of ego state work online. So absolutely, absolutely. Also, we're also aware there might be pre-verbal ego states or very silent ego states, those that don't have a voice or refuse to talk. And so we can work with other ego states to have voice for a pre-verbal state, a state that was formed before our ability to communicate. Or if its ego state is refusing to talk, as I said, another state can take on the role of communication for that. And also very much with malevolent ego states that are, I mean, malevolent ones can change, by the way, but they're the ones that might be punishing us. So you often see malevolent ego states with OCD, with addictive behaviors, sexual addictions and drug addictions, self-harming behaviors and things like that. They might be malevolent, but they can be worked with and they can certainly change. And very much as part of all of this, introjects do come forward and we empower our clients over the introjects that are there. So one thing to remember, ego states should never be asked to leave, as I said before. They are a part of the person. It can be their choice to go into the background, become dormant if they wish, but we never ask them to leave simply because they could get offended, and that just drives the dysfunction even further. We need to work through, or ideally work through, ego states, or an ego state to its complete resolution, resolving its issues, resolving its beliefs, and so on. And we know that it can become it can hide and become very uncooperative if it feels threatened. So the basic premise here, like with all parts work, but certainly very much within ego state work, we're very respectful to ego states. We ask permission for them to step aside and to allow another ego state to come into the executive. We ask permission from ego states if they would like to talk to each other. And so it becomes a very positive way of talking, but also we're trying to ensure that the ego states don't get upset or upset with each other. As I say, it's a bit, with family therapy concepts, giving ego states a voice, giving ego states an ability to raise up their own conflicts and so on, in a positive way, in an empowering way. So what is it used to treat? Many different things. Basically, it's used to treat quite severe conditions. So PTSD, certainly because of the dissociative nature here, PTSD is very much an element within this. Acute stress disorder as well. Somebody who's been recently, hasn't developed PTSD, but have recently, for example, the people on La Palma, where the volcano is erupting. Some of them will be going on to, people affected will have acute stress disorder, that acute stressful reaction, which, if processed appropriately, it then will go over a period of time. If not processed, it turns into PTSD. But it can be used early on to help the processing and managing the processing of acute stress disorders. Certainly with eating disorders, the ego states that are driving the eating for whatever reason can be worked with, and they quite often link back to traumatized ego states and so on. Obsessive compulsive disorders, working with malevolent states or working with states that are driving this because they're protector states who've kind of got it wrong, that by going and switching the light switch on and off 200 times, or repeating that set of prayers for an hour, and if you've got to get it right, the protector state says if you get it wrong, you've got to start all over again. So that type of mindset. We've got the psychosomatic disorders, the areas where people are somatizing, physically somatizing their symptoms. And so it's often thought that there's it's acting out if you're using, acting in behaviors rather, you're using in a child concept. But we can work with the ego states that are triggering that. Anger and other acting out behaviors can also be worked with. Addictions, very much, we look at the addicted state, what it's trying to do. The addicted state will be potentially a protector state trying to do its job. It might be a state that has learnt that through the pleasure of drugs, sex, or whatever, alcohol, it's learned that it can get away from the bad feelings, that sort of thing. Yes, you can use it for weight management, but it's very useful with complex weight management, where the overeating is a symptom of something deep and something traumatic, and the weight gain is part of that. Certainly with a wide variety of mood disorders, the parts that are generating the moods, what are they in conflict with? And not all bad stuff, certainly with sporting performance, sporting and performance enhancements. It's also very good at working with them. Can you use ego states with a child 10 years old? Yes, you can use ego states with a child who is perhaps got a fear of the dark, because you would say there is an ego state there. It's a very young ego state. It's got fear. So there is a protector state who might be taking, telling them not to go into the dark. And yes, Rania, speaking to a body part. Yes, I often get my clients to speak to a body part. In my head, I conceptualized the body part as an ego state, and I work with that within with the client. And Attica, I will come to PTSD and ego states versus EMDR in the next slide, I think it is. So I'll answer that in a moment. So there is a wide variety of things that it can be used for, including severe dissociative disorders and including dissociative identity disorder. However, and schizophrenia elements within there can be used. However, it's done in conjunction with patients, with the patient in this particular consideration, their healthcare team. So there will be part of an overall approach to therapy, as opposed to this being the only approach with something that strong. So to get to answer Attica's question, ego state therapy, as mentioned very early on, it integrates with many things. First and foremost, yes, we had somebody, I can't remember who it was, mentioning inner child. It can take the inner child concept and add to it, or you can be doing inner child, you can be doing ego states, and then good gosh, can't say it, and an inner child will step forward, and so it very nicely integrates there. With EMDR, it certainly does integrate with EMDR. There's a lot of research now coming out looking at the two working together. Within EMDR, and apologies if I'm using terminology some of you might not follow if you don't know it. EMDR, when we're working on it, there's something called the node or the target, which is the worst part of an incident, for example, that we want to process out. Now, what the EMDR people have found with the ego state people is that sometimes the node can be treated as an ego state. So if you're getting into a point where you've got a blockage in processing, the node is not processing out, you can bring in ego state concepts and ask the node to start to speak to itself. We then change the node into a concept of an ego state, find out what's blocking it, do some ego state therapy with it, and then go back. Once it's satisfied, go back and then continue with EMDR. And even when I've been working with ego states, sometimes a traumatized ego state will come forward, one that perhaps we haven't known has been there. It comes forward, and if I, with my clients' informed consent, judge it's appropriate, then I can bring in EMDR to process the fear and the mood, the anxieties, and so on with EMDR. Once I've done that, I can ask another ego state to come forward, and I just get back to ego state therapy. It's also useful within CBT, because when we're working with beliefs, and CBT, REBT, when we're working with beliefs, you can ask and move into working with the ego state that holds on to those beliefs. And you can then start working with CBT approaches within that, disputing and so on, with that particular ego state. And then once you work with that ego state, you can go back to CBT approaches itself. And obviously, because of its nature, hypnotherapy as well. Basically, it will integrate with just about any therapy there is out there. There is always a way, but the main ones that we've seen it are integrate with our inner child approaches, EMDR, CBT, hypnotherapy. I know a lot of people within the counselling world, they also use it to work with their clients. So it has a way of, there are ways of fitting it into just about everything. So in summary, and I've gone a little bit over, but it's a very powerful therapy. It's used to effectively treat many, many different challenging disorders that are out there. And it really integrates well with other therapies. It's used an awful lot, and its use is being increased now. And it's an excellent conduit for helping a client to gain insight, to helping a client become empowered, and in so doing, go through their own processes of change with regards to that. And then, of course, you know, we do teach it. So I'm just going to mention briefly what we do. I know Julian is there, and we'll be sending more information out to you. But it's a combination of the two schools. So we're doing it globally. And for people who want to know, we have accreditation from the National Council of Psychotherapists and the International Council of Psychotherapists for this particular course, and our EMDR course as well. So hang on, I've seen a couple of chats. Oh yes, the recording. That I'll hand you over to Julian for recordings. He's the font of all knowledge about that. So with the training, just note so that you know, it's open to therapists from all psychotherapies. I mean, yeah, we're hypnotherapists, but we also train in non-hypnotherapy approaches. So it is open to therapists from all psychotherapies. And we do, within our training, look at how you can integrate it within your own therapy. You don't need to be a hypnotherapist, therefore, to do the training. Julian is going to be sending out some information for you. And of course, you know, if you looking at that, we are very happy to answer questions about the course. If you want to, you can visit our two websites, you know, LSCCH for Europe and the UK, and Asia for Asia and Australia and so on. And here's a couple of email addresses for you. But with that in mind, okay, I'm just seeing, right, lovely. Right, I will take questions. Thank you for your nice comments. Would I recommend doing inner child first? Let me just, I'll keep that up there just in case people are taking that information down. Where? Yes and no. It depends on what I'm doing. I love inner child. So if I'm working with a client who presents who's got that concept of inner child, I will work within that. And I will bring in information with regards to, I'll bring in, sorry, not information, I'll bring in techniques that I know within ego states into it. So I merge the two. If I really feel it should be going into ego state therapy, then I get the informed consent of the client, and I will say to you, I have never yet had somebody who said no to it, because if they're already in the child concept, they easily buy into the concepts that we have within ego state therapy. So it depends, if I'm working with the ego state therapy and I'm noticing a childlike state keeps coming forward, I then might change that more into a more inner child approach than ego state approach. So that's what I would do with that particular situation. Quite often it's down to how you like to work and how you've started to work with a client. I'm just going to stop the share so I can see people. Any other questions that you'd like to ask and say?
Peter, this is Chokman here.
Hi.
Hi, well, nice to meet you again after some 10, 15 years.
It has been a while.
Yes, and well, I'm glad that you mentioned something about as affiliating with Australian Hypnotherapy Associations. I'm based in Melbourne now, so I'm looking forward to that.
Well, we're a recommended school for the Australian Society of Clinical Hypnosis.
Oh, that's great. Now, just a question relating to the point you make about you should never ask the ego state to leave. Now, does that any ego state, does it actually leave, or does it actually just sort of go dormant, or
it will go dormant? The theory is, and of course this is theory, blimey, Bernadette, I've just seen that. I didn't see there. Hi, how are you? Somebody who trained with me 20 years ago. The idea is, and the theory is, there you are, I see you waving. The idea is that an ego state never goes. An ego state will always be there, Theoretically, ego states die when we die. So an ego state can choose to go dormant and can be dormant. There are lots of different dormant ego states that each and everyone here, there's goodness knows how many people, over 100, I think. Every one of us has these little dormant ego states because they're no longer used, but they're still a part of us. And if we dig, or there is a reason why it connects into that, is a connect into that, that brings the ego state forward again. It comes back. Yes, John, John Paul, I remember. And just a quick one there is Tanzira. Yes, we've got one in 8 weeks' time. We've also already set the dates for the one early next year. So keep an eye out on that, for the course rather. So they will go dormant. They can choose to go dormant. They can choose, if their function really is no longer necessary, they can choose to basically change the function. So they can do something different. We can work with them, we can challenge them, we can do all sorts of different things that will allow them to either be functional, or if they want to go to sleep, rest, just be an observer. So the point here is it goes to that basic principle that everything created by the mind, even the malevolent states, they've become malevolent for a reason, has a function. It has a function. And so what we don't want to do is to upset the ego state, push the ego state away, and just say, hey, you're no longer relevant, because it will sit and it will fester and it will, it's like if I'd picked one of you out and said, well, actually, I don't want to talk to you, you're irrelevant, you're bad, go away. Well, you'll go off and just sit there, oh, that really awful man. So that's what happens with ego states as well. And so the point here is resolving the ego states, helping the ego states to feel wanted and feel a part of them. Oh gosh, Jackie, wow, as well. Lovely to see you. Yes, I saw your face. I remember there's several people here I also remember. But those parts are a valuable part of us, and that's the premise here. Don't tell your clients off. So therefore, if you tell off an ego state, you're telling your client off. So you don't, we've got to remember the ego state is part of the whole and identifies as part of the whole. So a nasty message that you're bad, go away. You're actually saying that to your client. You're saying to your client, you're bad, go away. So we don't want that. We want resolution, so to speak. Anyone else? Let's see. Okay, well, look, thank you, everyone. It's been lovely to see old friends, new friends, and people I've never met before. And hopefully, some of you might choose to, if you want to, come on the Ego States course. Those of you who know, it's myself and Bill Frost, and sometimes Charles Caruana as well. We'll teach on that state, on that course. So we bring our ego states forward. So, and it is an online course. So the nice thing about what we're doing as well is because it's online, we have people from around the world. So not only do you learn therapeutic sharing, we've got cultural sharing that goes on. And I've certainly learned a lot that's helped me in my therapy from just having that mix of people I work with culturally now. So we look forward to A, seeing you on one of our courses, or B, we're really starting to do a lot of these free things. C, we've got a conference coming up free. So we'll also put you on, send out information about that. It's in November, over 2 days, and we've got speakers from Australia and the UK, Malaysia. I think we've got American people speaking as well, American therapists. So Fiona, hello. Yes, we are. We still have our eyes on Glasgow. So, oops, somebody's sharing their screen. How nice. So look, I'm going to stop speaking now because I've got to go in for a clinical supervision very shortly. And I look forward to, as I say, seeing you all again very, very soon. So have a nice time, and I will hand back to Julian, who will do whatever he has to do with the video and everything else. So take care, everyone. See you soon. Lovely, as I say, to meet you all again. Feels like coming home, even though I'm home. So speak to you soon. Bye-bye.